As the silver rays of the moon shone over a vast, swampy prairie, a cold, subtle wind whistled through the trees encircling it. A creek deep and wide enough to allow the passage of canoes cut at the edge of the prairie and snaked off to places unknown. At the edge of the forest, away from the creek, a small tent large enough for the family of 4 occupying it rustled against the wind. The Davises were long overdue for a vacation, and though they couldn't afford one, William, the man of the house, had the idea to go camping over the weekend. They brought plenty of supplies and found a nice spot a few miles deep in Conecuh National Forest, near the southern edge of Alabama and north of the Florida Panhandle. William slept beside his wife of 17 years, and she cuddled up with both their 5-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter, resting from an eventful day of catching frogs, canoeing, and sightseeing. They had planned to do more tomorrow: catch some fish, light a bonfire, and maybe spot an alligator. That day would never come, because as they were sleeping, 6 canoes rowed down the creek and to the water's edge. They beached upon the shore. Each canoe carried 2 people cloaked in gray robes, and their hoods concealed their faces. They were known as the Gray Ghosts of Conecuh Forest, and tonight they were hunting. They spotted the Davises' tent far in the distance, and they approached it. The leader of these cultists remained in the first canoe and watched as his subjects drew closer to their targets. Once they reached the blue tent, they intruded upon them and smothered their faces with a black rag that smelled earthy. The husband, William, the wife, Brenda, the son, Daniel, the daughter, Amy, all of the Davises were unconscious. One by one, they were removed from their tent and placed on a stretcher. The cultists carried their abductees across the open prairie and to their leader, Thaddeus Grimshaw XII. Thaddeus was a tall and imposing man, his stare cold, unnerving. He studied Brenda, Daniel, Amy, and William as if he were a lion hunting a gazelle. Thaddeus said, "A family of 4 can keep the church fed for 10 days. He had a slight lean to his gait. A bushy beard seldom groomed covered his chin and mouth. Hair, thin and wispy, swayed in the wind as he examined the family of 4. He tapped his pen against his chin and surveyed the 4 abductees laying in front of him. 2 of Thaddeus' strongest cultists perished because of old age, and the church's food stores were already low. A manor and chapel were in dire need of repair. The meat they had collected throughout the summer either rotted or had been consumed. The challenges the church faced seemed endless. People didn't live forever, and the freezers they used to keep their meat fresh broke down. The age of the church was starting to show, and Thaddeus knew that he needed fresh blood in the church, but he also knew that he and his subjects must eat. He contemplated whether the father should serve as nutrition or use him for labor. He wasn't sure, as people didn't venture deep into Conecuh National Forest as much as they used to, and this made hunting more frequent. As a result of the more frequent hunts, the sightings of the cultists, or as the locals called them, the Gray Ghosts, increased, and since those sightings increased, fewer people camped in the forest. A vicious cycle had developed, and the cultists in the Church of Syn were starving because of it. More hunts for less food. Consuming any other kind of meat is forbidden, therefore hunting deer or any other animal is out of the question. To consume any meat other than human flesh is to taint their soul and bar themselves from ever sitting with sin in the dark well, a place these people considered heaven. Though none of them knew what the dark well was, they still believed in it and refused to eat any meat that wasn't pure. Thaddeus, whose rank was surpassed only by sin himself, could not afford to appear weak in front of his subjects. His grandson, Theodore, stood at the ready, prepared to whisk the people away. He was a short man with a bowl haircut, not too old either, and the heir to the Church of Syn. His father died 7 years ago from disease, and he has never met his mother. Age was something people in the cult tend to forget, but Theodore, Thaddeus Grimshaw XII, is 28 and balding. He too had a bushy beard, though it is brown with a slight orange hint. Thaddeus urged Theodore to come over at once, and together they examined the family of 4 one last time. Thaddeus turned his gaze toward the gray clouds above. The air was thick with a swampy odor, and a subtle drizzle rolled across them. Heavy clouds, full of rain, cascaded across the sky, and the grass bent to the breeze which pushed it. As curtains of moss swayed from the southern live oaks, Thaddeus knew he must decide soon. Rain was coming, and he could smell it. Thaddeus said, "We will use the father and replace him with a lone camper whenever we find one. I know that people rarely camp these days, but the manor and chapel need to be repaired. Theodore, instruct the others to spare the father, as we will need him, and prepare the others for consumption." The cultists placed each member of the Davis family into a canoe, and they paddled down the creek. The canoes which held Brenda and Daniel and Amy veered left, while the one which held William stayed right. Either way, they both sailed into obscurity. They brought William to a small wooden cabin and kept him drugged long enough to allow a few days to pass. Water was given to him by gently pouring it into his pried open mouth, and this was done whenever he began to stir. Asleep enough to drink, but not awake enough to be alert. Once Thaddeus gave the okay to allow William to wake up, they bound him and seated him in front of a dining room table. And now William Davis sat tied to a seat. Thick black hair remained unclean and dirt covered his face. His head wobbled from side to side as he woke. In front of him was a long cherry oak table, and at the center was a boar's head placed on a platter, and in its mouth was an apple. Thaddeus noticed William begin to stir and gestured with his index finger for Theodore to set the table. Thaddeus studied William's arms and chest. He surmised that William would be strong enough to do the grunt work. Several windows in the chapel had to be replaced, and the longer he thought, the more jobs there were. After Theodore left the dining room, 3 cultists entered, carrying a plate of food in each hand. They set the table and then returned with silverware, candles, 3 candelabras, and a box of matches. The candles were white and new. Thaddeus aligned the candelabras and placed a candle into each holder. As William began to gain consciousness, Thaddeus lit the candles and studied his captive. William opened his eyes and tried to lift his hand to no avail. Thaddeus's eyes shifted as his lips curved down and his brows began to furrow. He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Thaddeus said, "Dear sir, we found you in the swamp, and I am glad you're well enough to wake up." William scanned the room. His heart raced while his frown deepened as he looked for his family. He said, "Where are my kids and wife?" He noticed the plate of food sitting in front of him, a steaming slab of meat, one large potato, and a dinner roll the size of his fist. Beside the plate sat a cup of tea and water. Thaddeus said, "Please." He pointed to Theodore. "Untie this man. I have no reason to fear him, and now that we know he is not a threat and of sound mind, we may break bread with him." Thaddeus reached for his cup and took a drink of water and cleared his throat. He lifted his fork and knife and pierced the slab of meat. He cut a small piece as he said, "My name is Thaddeus Grimshaw X, and I am the voice of Syn. A subject of mine heard screams from the forest, and we found a mother fleeing from a bear. With her were 2 young children, and somehow you were still at rest in your tent. I do not know where your family ran off to, but the bear had started to charge for your tent. We scared it off and brought you here to safety." Theodore removed a small pocket knife from his gray robe and cut the ropes tied around William's arms and legs. Thaddeus continued, "We intervened and provided a safe place for you to reside." Thaddeus stood up and towered over the table. He swept his hand across the boar's head, platter of grapes, apples, pears, slabs of meat, and a pitcher of wine. He said, "I offer you this banquet to replenish your stores of energy, so that way you may leave as soon as you are able." William's mouth felt dry, and his tongue stuck to the bottom of his mouth. He said, "I was with my wife, son, and daughter. You mean to tell me that a bear chased them off, and I didn't hear any of it?" William's brows fell as his heart sank. Sweat beaded across his skin as goosebumps surfaced. Thaddeus folded his arms and mirrored William's frown. He said, "Unfortunately, we noticed a large gash at the back of your skull. We presumed you had been struck or fell on a rock. You have been freed from your restraints and you are welcome to leave. We are a kind people at the Church of Syn, and we only wish you well. I understand your doubt. I understand your concerns about your family. Last we knew, we saw them on the outskirts of the forest, lost and cold. We tried to bring them here, but they fled deeper into the swamp." William rubbed the back of his head and felt the gash Thaddeus had mentioned. He stood up and the world wobbled as he approached the door. Suddenly, everything turned sideways, and 2 cultists caught him as he fell to his side. The cultists walked him to his chair. Thaddeus said, "Sir, you have been with us for 2 days, and been fighting off a mighty fever. We do not know the severity of your illness, but I encourage you to eat well of our food, or at least drink the water provided. You are ill and not fit to foray into the swamp. I will not make you stay, but as you may have just learned, you cannot even walk to the door without collapsing." William sat down. He counted the cultists surrounding him. 5, 6, 8, 10 people staring at him. The hoods of their dark gray robes concealed their faces, and the robe itself draped to the floor. When the cultists walked, William couldn't see so much as their shoes. They bunched together in the dining room, even though it was small. The cabin itself wasn't very large, and it was a wonder how 10 cultists plus Thaddeus could fit into such a small space. They watched him as he watched them. They were silent. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and musk, and it was humid. William sat up in his chair and studied his plate of food and looked at his glass of water. He said, "Can you at least walk me to the kitchen, please?" 2 cultists crossed to his chair and escorted him to the kitchen, and once there, William filled a glass with water and drank. He downed 4 cups of water before he felt his thirst had been quenched, but his throat still felt sore, his head ached, and his face felt hot. He wondered if he was running a fever. Once the water had settled in his stomach, he requested to use the bathroom, and the 2 cultists walked him to it. William was escorted through a quaint, dingy hall, decorated with paintings of people he had never seen. The odor of musk persisted. He assumed that this pervasive odor was everywhere. Once he arrived in the bathroom, he opened the door and stumbled in. The bathroom was small and didn't have a shower or bathtub. Cracked white tiles made up the walls, and the ceiling was home to a colony of black mold. A vanity marred with grime reflected the soft rays of the sunlight. A brown-stained toilet and sink were to his left. William sat and pushed his head into his palms. He thought of the camping trip and the last time he saw his family. The night they were abducted, he made s'mores with Daniel and Amy. He and Brenda told campfire stories. Horror stories about teachers giving too much homework. Though those memories were just made, he already missed them. He missed his wife and the way her burgundy hair swayed in the wind, his daughter and her chuckled laugh, his son and his darling of a smile. He thought of these things and more. It only made him feel worse. His stomach dropped as he hoped they were safe and looking for him with the help of the police. He felt something twist in his stomach, and the urge to vomit tightened his throat. If these people abducted him, he knew that they probably abducted them, and who knows what has happened between then and now. He leaned over the sink and splashed cold water onto his face. The dirt washed away, and he stared at his reflection. Where he was, who he was with, and where he needed to go clawed at the front of his mind, but he did not have an answer for any of those questions. The urge to relieve himself overtook him, and he filled the toilet with brown urine. The odor invaded his nose, and he gagged. It smelled repulsive, and he knew something was wrong. Of all the times he's ever been sick, he's never smelled such a foul odor. Something foreign was coursing through him, but he didn't know what. He quickly washed his hands and opened the door. No farther than 2 feet away were the 2 cultists who escorted him to the bathroom. They didn't say a word. They only took him by the arm and escorted him back to the table. William sat down in the chair and studied Thaddeus. He knew that the man who controlled the cultists, the resources, everything sat in front of him. William guessed that something was wrong with the food offered to him, and that the water was likely poisoned. Nothing made sense, nothing. He wondered why they didn't just get rid of him. Why offer him food and water? Though he was suspicious, he was no fool. William knew that he had to play along in order to escape this place. William said, "Forgive me, but I have this horrible feeling that I can't describe. You say I'm in a church, but it doesn't seem like a church. I don't see a chapel or any priests or anything, not even a Bible." Thaddeus gestured for everyone to leave the room. Thaddeus began to quietly eat his food. William continued to express his worry until there was nothing left to say. Silence grew in the room as William looked around and sat back in his chair. Thaddeus had nearly completed his meal. William said, "For fear of being poisoned, can you take the first bite?" Thaddeus nodded. William sliced off a piece of the steak, which had now become cold, and passed it to Thaddeus. His captor ate it without issue. Thaddeus said, "I understand your concern, and I would like to take this moment to mention that you are welcome to cook your own meal by yourself if you are concerned about poisoning. Your worries are entirely valid, and you are right to be suspicious. I would be too if I woke in a strayed swamp surrounded by strange people and without my family. I implore you to do what you feel is right." William nodded and chewed on the idea. This group of people, which he learned belonged to a church, provided him with shelter, food, and water. He thought about how he has the freedom to leave and that he is no longer restrained. Thinking about these things eased his mind, though he could not bring himself to eat the food provided for him. Thaddeus had finished his steak and sat his silverware in the middle of the plate. He snapped his fingers and a robed individual entered the room. Thaddeus said, "This steak was cooked to perfection and absolutely delicious." He patted his mouth with a napkin. Beads of grease clung to his beard. He continued, "Will you please remove my plate and silverware as I am done? Also, will you remove the meal prepared for our guest?" Thaddeus turned away from William and glanced out the window. He continued, "As I anticipate he will be leaving soon and does not feel comfortable eating with us, which is entirely understandable." Thaddeus pressed his hands together and pointed at the cultist standing in front of him. He said, "Thank you for your kindness and generosity, thank you. You are an honored member of the church, and I value your contribution." As the cultist picked up William's plate of food, William felt a bit of guilt as he watched it be carried away. He stood up and noticed that Thaddeus also stood up. William said, "I thank you for everything, but..." His head swirled as he stood, and William slumped back into his chair. His cheeks were damp with sweat, and the world seemed to tilt, despite him standing still. Thaddeus said, "I have matters to attend to. Every day at noon we must make peace with sin and whisper a prayer. Today I will pray that you are returned to good health, and that you will find your family." Thaddeus exhaled and walked toward the hallway which led to the bathroom. He turned and said, "It was nice meeting you, William, but I must now make my absence. If you wish to return to your campsite, tread carefully, head northwest, and your tent should still be standing. It's about a 2-hour walk from here." William felt a hard stone form in his throat. He knew that he couldn't walk such a distance as sick as he was, and hunger now caused his stomach to cramp. Thaddeus shut the door as he left the room. William sat at the edge of the table. 9 other cultists followed Thaddeus out of the dining room, leaving behind one. The cultist wiped down the table with a cloth, and for a moment William saw the glimmer of a young woman's eyes. Black hair fell from the hood, and it was then that their eyes met. He looked at the cultist and said, "Is this really a church?" Silence was William's answer. William stood up, and the world sank around him. He approached the door and reached for the handle. As he grabbed the handle, his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he collapsed. The cultist whispered into his ear, "This is all a bad nightmare. Please wake up." William opened his eyes and found himself lying in a warm bed. Beside him was a single candle. The air felt warm and smelled like cinnamon and apples, perhaps the aroma of a candle. His head swirled as he looked at the ceiling and tried to fixate on a single tile. It seemed to move and twist inward on itself. Everything was distorting, and it hurt to keep his eyes open for long. William rolled over in bed and felt sweat stream down his face. A sudden knock captured his attention. William stared at the door, unsure if he was hallucinating. Thaddeus entered the room and dropped to one knee. He said, I believe it may be the flu. There is water at your bedside. I will not impose our church onto you, but I will say that earning the favor of Syn would free you of your ailments. Syn knows of the remedies that can cure you." Thaddeus released a heavy sigh and his face sunk. He said, "I begged for his mercy with regards to you, but Syn would not give you his blessing. Only members of the church can benefit from him. I apologize because you must leave before tomorrow morning, as you are not a member of the church. I sincerely apologize." William closed his eyes and begged to wake up from this nightmare. The cultist who cleaned the table entered his thoughts. From what he could tell, she didn't appear happy or that she even belonged here. He knew, or at least suspected, that perhaps she too had been abducted. He took a deep breath and exhaled. Whether they're poisoning him or he is genuinely sick doesn't matter. William thought of everything. The female cultist, his wife, his kids. He knew that if he tried to leave today, he would die and become a meal for a fortunate gator. Joining this so-called church was his only option. At least these people provide food, water, and shelter. He guessed that if he were hungry enough, he might eat. William said, "So, to get help from the church, I must join the church." Thaddeus said, "Unfortunately so. We are limited with regards to labor and food rations." William pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "If I joined the church, would Syn help me look for my family?" Thaddeus smirked as he replied, "We saw your youngest daughter in the forest about 30 minutes from here. Her hair is frazzled, clothes are torn. She screamed as we approached and fled into the darkness. If you were well enough to call to her, you could save her. But you are sick. You need the help of Syn to save her." William pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Thaddeus continued, "If you wish to join us, I can give you an elixir that will subdue your agony. It is a mixture of yarrow, echinacea, and Syn's blessing." William said, "What is Syn's blessing?" Thaddeus proudly smiled and said, "It is a type of flower that our ancestors have cultivated for this church. It is a beautiful flower resembling a rose and can cure most ailments. When mixed with yarrow, echinacea, and passion flower, it becomes a powerful elixir that will cure you. For the sake of your family, it is in your best interest to get well as soon as you can." William tried to sit up but failed to do so. His head felt heavy and he heaved. William said, "Fine, sure. I guess I'll join it if it means finding my family." Thaddeus smiled and stood up. He left the room, and William thought about too many things, but his illness pushed him into the land of nightmares. Awoken by a knock on his door, William peeled his eyes open and listened as Thaddeus returned with a small glass cup. Inside the cup was a faint pink liquid. William could feel the weight of his arms. They seemed too heavy to move, and his head felt the same. He tried to sit up but couldn't. As his heart began to race, William felt paralyzed. Turning William's head and propping his mouth open, Thaddeus lifted the glass to William's mouth. He said, "I will give you this, and you must sleep. When next you awake, we will go to the church, and once there, Syn will give you his blessing. It seems the flu has made you so weak that you cannot lift your own head. I will help you." Thaddeus scooted closer and wrapped his fingers around William's jaw and opened his mouth. He tilted the cup and smiled as the pink liquid pattered onto his captive's tongue. William closed his eyes as it felt quite good to feel the cool liquid trickle down his throat. It tasted bitter, but it was at least palpable. Thaddeus rested William's head onto the pillow and pulled the blanket to his chin. As he lay motionless, the air around him became cold and he began to shiver. He tried to lift his legs, slide his arms out of the bed. He tried to do everything, but did nothing. Not a muscle moved, and soon he found himself entirely paralyzed. William woke up to the sound of crickets and lapping water. He opened his eyes, and the night sky was peppered with stars. A torch crackled beside him. He tried to move his arms. His limbs were bound, and as he looked up, he noticed Thaddeus sitting beside him, pointing in what seemed to be random directions. William said, "Thaddeus, it worked." His throat wasn't sore, and his legs did not ache. He felt well. The muscles in his arms no longer throbbed, and the world didn't feel as though it was turning. Thaddeus glanced at something far off in the distance and then looked down at William. Thaddeus said, "Ah, you're awake. We bound you because you are a fitful sleeper. Syn's blessing tends to make those who drink it flail in their sleep. Allow me to unbind you, friend." He reached for the knotted ropes and untied them. As each knot was undone, William relaxed his shoulders, exhaled a deep breath, and felt goosebumps prickle his skin. A chill encompassed him as he sat up in the canoe, not a chill brought on by temperature, but of sudden fear. The light from the torch illuminated curtains of moss dangling from branches high above them, and duckweed floating atop the water's surface. The sound of a paddle breaking water emerged every few seconds as they moved toward an undisclosed location. William noted that he truly did feel better, but fear persisted. He knew there were gators in these swamps, and that they could tip over their canoe if they wanted to. The small canoe he was in wouldn't protect him much, and he knew it. William glanced around and noticed 3 more small canoes behind him, and one in front of him. As he smelled the odors the swamp offered and pushed deeper into the blackness of the night, mosquitoes nipped at his neck and back. Thaddeus smiled as they drifted into a soft yellow glow emanating from a torch planted at the swamp's edge. William sat forward as the shoreline came closer, and off in the distance were more torches. They led to a vast manor half exposed by light and half consumed by darkness. The canoes gently sailed into the respective dock and swayed from side to side as Thaddeus tied each of them to their post. William couldn't remember seeing cultists appear from the thick night, but suddenly he saw them approaching. 3 of them, each walking in single file to the canoe, each holding a torch. Once they reached the dock, Thaddeus gestured for the other cultists to leave their canoes and follow him. He took a torch from one of his subjects and led them to the manor. Thick moss claimed the siding and covered the entire wall facing the swamp. The moss had spread across most of the manor, and vines snaked around the entire building. William felt as though his heart was going to burst. As his eyes shifted from cultist to cultist, manor siding to moss, and window to window, he swallowed a heavy knot in his throat. The windows of the manor were tall, square at the bottom and egg-shaped at the top. An orange glow passed through the windows, and the rooms inside the manor seemed dark. Cultists he could barely see milled about inside before leaving the manor in a single file line, each of them lifting a torch, igniting it, and then carrying it as they met with Thaddeus. William thought about fleeing into the forest, but knew that he was in the middle of the swamp at night. He accepted that for right now, he must at least just play along. Thaddeus nodded at each robed figure as they approached him. A column of torches led past the manor and toward the chapel, old and constructed with wood and painted white. The siding had now become green and covered in vines. Sheets of moss dangled beside the chapel, concealing its roof and the area around it. At its base were rose-colored flowers that consisted of 7 petals, and they were attached to thick pink roots. The flowers did not sprout very high and bunched up like grapes on a vine and gave a sweet aroma. Thaddeus led William toward the chapel, and a whitish gold glow passed through stained windows. The doors were heavy and made of thick cedar wood. Once they passed through the threshold of the chapel, 14 cultists stood near an altar, and something sat on top of it. William couldn't tell what it was from the chapel doorway. They stood beside each other, flanking outward from a figure that sat at the center of them all, hunched over and brown. Its hair draped low, and it seemed to focus on the floor. The scent of rot and taste of decay pervaded William's senses. Torches and candles dimly lit the interior of the chapel, revealing 2 rows of pews and an organ behind the altar on which the brown, decaying figure sat. Thaddeus walked down between the pews toward the figure sitting atop the altar. He spread his arms and embraced it before turning around and inviting William to join him. He said, "You are safe here, friend. Come, come." The cultists which were behind him closed the door, and his heart sank as he heard it lock. William exhaled a deep breath and scanned the room. Thaddeus and 14 cultists were ahead of him, 7 on each side of the altar. 6 cultists were behind him, now inching closer. A tender voice whispered, "Go, or they'll kill you." He second-guessed whether he heard it or not, because the voice was so faint. He lowered his chin and approached the source of the odor. The putrid smell intensified as he closed the distance between him and the thing sitting on the altar. Once he arrived, William's jaw fell agape as he realized it was a mummy dressed in a robe sitting on top of the altar. Thaddeus said, "Here you stand before the father of this church, Syn. His physical body, preserved for generations, remains, and it is as glorious today as it was then. I request that you drop to your knees and make your appeal to join the church so that you, too, may join him in the dark well." William looked at Thaddeus, who was now beaming, and then glanced at the other cultists who were still concealed by their hooded robes. He began to formulate a plan to escape in the morning, run away into the swamp. The cultists encircled him, and they stood side by side, their robes draped to the floor, and not a face could be seen. However, the black hair of one cultist fell from their hood. He took a mental note of this and wondered if the hair belonged to the girl who cleaned off the table. She was shorter than he was, perhaps up to his chin, and was slender. He looked away from her and returned his attention to Syn. For the sake of his own life, he knew he had to play along with the charade. William dropped to one knee and looked at Syn's decaying toes. He said, "Followers of Syn, I am grateful for your hospitality and the second chance you've given me in life. I hereby request that you accept me into your family." Thaddeus placed his hand on William's shoulder and squeezed it. He said, "Make your pact with blood and spread it across your God's face." He withdrew a small blade from his robe and placed it in William's hand. William turned the blade over and counted the number of people in the chapel. Thaddeus 1, 7 cultists on each side of Thaddeus, 15 and 6 behind him, 21 people surrounding him. He knew he couldn't fight these people off. Reluctantly, his fingers wrapped tight around the blade, and he pulled it down. Blood dripped down the blade as he reached for Syn's mummified face. He closed his eyes as he rubbed his palm on Syn's cheek and felt his grotesque cheekbone against his fingertips. Once the gesture had been completed, Thaddeus clapped and pulled William a few steps backward. Thaddeus said, "You are now bound by blood to the Church of Syn. I ask that everyone reveal themselves to our newest brother and welcome William into our family." William turned around and saw 20 people smiling. He returned his focus to where he thought the girl was, but saw a short, bald man clapping. She had moved, and now he had no idea who or where she was. There were 4 women, none of which had black hair. Together and all at once they said, "Welcome, Brother William." William waved as his eyes darted for the exit. Thaddeus said, "Now give me a moment to teach the way of the church. If you appease Syn, you will live for eternity with him in the dark well. We have 10 commandments. We expect them to be followed. To break any of them is punishable by death. 1. Only the flesh of man is to be consumed. 2. Do not steal from fellow members. 3. Do not murder your fellow members. 4. Do not engage in heresy. 5. Do not deny our faith. 6. Do not speak to non-members. 7. Do not deceive fellow members. 8. Celibacy is expected from all males. The only exception is the voice of Syn. 9. The blessing of Syn must never be rejected. 10. Syn weaves the threads of our lives. To question his motives is forbidden. Do you understand? William looked at Thaddeus, who stood proud and gleefully. William said, "I do." He figured out what the purpose of this cult was. As he looked around, he noticed that all of the women were young, slender, and would be considered to be quite attractive, and yet the men were muscular, strong, virile. William knew that he is here only for his labor, while the women serve a more humiliating function. He thought of the dark well and used the topic to drive Thaddeus away from the commandments. William said, "You keep mentioning the dark well, but I don't know what that is." Thaddeus said, "It's an endless paradise where you and Syn can rest together. You can bask in his silence, absorb his wisdom, and have your fantasies and desires fulfilled. The dark well is where we find and build our paradise in the company of Syn. There you will find happiness and bliss." William nodded and said, "Right. Anyway, I am absolutely beat right now. I need sleep." Thaddeus nodded as he said, "Of course you do. Then let's cheer before you rest." William felt good until right before bed. The pain in his stomach returned, and he wondered where his family was. He couldn't tell if it was hunger that was causing the pain in his stomach or the stressful situation. Either way, he woke up early in the morning. The world wobbled once more, and he felt vomit clawing at the back of his throat. He looked forward, and a sudden idea came to him. He thought, "They're poisoning me and giving me an antidote." He sat up in bed and covered his mouth. Vomit spilled into his hands, and he studied the color of it. Red blood. He stood up and felt the world under him slip. William tried to catch himself as he tumbled to the ground. The ceiling spun, and the sound of footsteps caused his skin to curl and goosebumps to manifest. His throat ran dry as he watched the door open, and Thaddeus passed through the doorway. He leaned over William and seemed to study him for a moment before speaking. He said, "Each day we are required to receive Syn's blessing twice, once in the morning, once in the evening, lest we succumb to the evil spirits which set out to destroy us. Rise, William, so that we may drink and break bread as we discuss your obligations to the church." William covered his face and whispered, "You're poisoning me and giving me an antidote. How are you poisoning me?" Thaddeus knelt beside William and whispered, "Dear brother, a spider has bitten you. Its venom will not go away. It multiplies in your blood and makes you sick. You need Syn's blessing to stop it from growing. Only then will it shrink. You must receive this blessing 2 times a day, lest you succumb to the venom. To receive your second blessing, you must first perform your duties for the church. As you can tell, the condition of the manor and chapel has declined significantly. Tomorrow, I will need you to repair a wall, and then you will receive your second blessing." Thaddeus handed William a cup filled with pink liquid. He whispered, "Drink and be well, so that you may do work with vigor and strength tomorrow." William turned his head away from the cup and said, "If I was bitten by a venomous spider, I need to go to the hospital." Thaddeus interrupted, "William, there is no ailment that Syn cannot cure. You've bound yourself to him, and now you belong to the church." Thaddeus gazed into William, and his eyes shifted as he looked for resistance. Thaddeus continued, "William, we saw your wife. She was with your son on the outskirts of the swamp. We have her and your son and your daughter. But you must drink. They are waiting for you, William, but you cannot go to them as you are." William closed his eyes for a few seconds and felt torn between believing what he thought was a lie and accepting the truth. The truth being that his family is dead. His stomach curled as he thought about what's real, and suddenly, the lie became more palpable. He faltered in his resolve and agreed to drink the liquid. Thaddeus pushed the cup to William's lips and tilted it. Thaddeus said, There. All who join the church resist in the beginning." William drank and laid his head back. Thaddeus continued, "Unfortunately, one key detail I forgot to mention. I learned just this morning that they had escaped and ran into the swamps. Sleep well, as tomorrow your aid is needed with the repair of our manor. Walls need to be rebuilt and graves dug. Now sleep." William looked at the ceiling, and he felt something inside him disconnect, as though the world didn't seem so dark. He smiled as a sense of euphoria washed over him. He relaxed. Thaddeus told him all he needed to know. His family is dead and has been since he arrived. An idea birthed into existence. Burn the place down, all of it, everyone. Suddenly, he felt good. Euphoria filled every fiber of his being. He smiled. He whispered to himself, "This is how I felt when I took painkillers." That drink was spiked with painkillers. William smiled, and he knew that what he felt wasn't genuine. He continued, "I'm drugged. Oh, and it feels..." He smiled. "Good." William closed his eyes and felt as though he were swimming. The day melted into night as William lay in the bed. He had nightmares, most of which he cannot remember, and at times felt a fever coursing through him. Eventually, the pink liquid, Syn's blessing, did its job and subdued his ailments. Now that the night had come and he had recovered, he found himself in between the realm of sleep and reality. For a moment, he swore he felt someone sit at the edge of his bed, but he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure about anything now and rolled over in bed, rubbed his eyes and opened them. Sitting beside him on the bed was a young woman, perhaps mid-20s, with black hair, blue eyes, and long eyelashes. She had a round, taut face and large eyes. Her beauty struck him and left him speechless. William pushed those feelings aside out of respect for his wife. He thought it was her, the cultist who had been helping him, but he wasn't certain. He said, "You're the cultist who's been helping me, right?" The girl nodded and said, "My name is Marie, and welcome to my beautiful nightmare. I've been trying to wake up, but Syn doesn't hear my prayers." William sat up in bed and Marie scooted closer. She said, "I want to wake up because I lost my 2 brothers and mom in this nightmare. Can you wake me up?" Marie inched closer and placed her hand on his knee. She said, "This is my nightmare, so I should be able to wake up, right?" William stared blankly and nodded. William said, "Your family is missing, too." Marie's eyes shifted to the door as she whispered, "Thaddeus has seen them. They're lost in the swamp. They're looking for me." William pushed his hands against his temples and bit his tongue. He realized Thaddeus had told her the same things he told him. He flinched as he thought about Marie's family and what may have come of them. He said, "Were you camping and then you woke up tied to a chair?" Marie nodded. "That's when I became aware I was dreaming. The things I've seen and had to do, it must be a nightmare, otherwise I've done horrible things. It's not real, the things I've done, no." She tapped her fingertips against her thigh as her eyes darted toward the door. Her brows lifted and she gasped. Marie continued, "Syn is a powerful God that will save you. Remember that." The door creaked open and Thaddeus poked his head into the room. He said, "Marie, I've been searching for you." Syn has requested that you spend the night with me. Come, come. Marie looked down and said, It's nice to meet you, William. It's all a dream. Thaddeus smiled as he said, A beautiful dream. He ran his fingers through her hair and brushed his hand down her shoulder. Marie shuddered, and Thaddeus seemed to like it. They left, and the door clicked shut. William sat up and noticed a piece of paper sitting where Marie was. He opened it, and it read, The water creates the nightmare. The blessing creates the beautiful dream. Please wake me up. William laid back into his bed and flipped the note over. He stuffed it into his mouth and chewed it until it broke down into mush. Once he was confident it could easily pass through the sewer, he arose from the bed and searched for a bathroom. William left his room and stood at the end of a long, narrow hall. The carpet was tan, and the hardwood floor it rested on was aged and brown. Flaking off the walls, paint chips were scattered across the floor. 6 bedrooms were on each side of the hall, and at the end was a large window. Each step he took reverberated through the hall. Between each door was a painting. Some were of the Manor, former voices of Syn, and women. Not one of the people painted were smiling. He walked farther down the hall and heard someone whisper, Please, wake me from this nightmare. He knew it wasn't Marie, as the voice belonged to a man. William deduced that this is a theme shared among the cultists. They are all living a nightmare. He found a bathroom and spit the note into the toilet. At this point, it had become little more than mush and went down with ease when he flushed. As he stood in the bathroom, an image of his son flashed into his mind, then his daughter, and then his wife. He reminded himself of the note and what Marie said. The water causes the nightmare. He thought, It's poisoned, and the antidote is that damn drink. If I'm poisoned right now and I don't drink that, I'll die. Oh God, how am I going to get out of this? William returned to his bedroom and lay on his bed. He thought of the gators which called the swamp home and tried to think of a way to escape. Was it even possible to escape? The sound of vehicles buzzing down a highway never came, only the persistent song of frogs and crickets. How deep in the swamp was he? William rolled over in his bed and listened to the voices of strangers he hadn't met whisper prayers that somehow they could wake up from this horrible nightmare. They prayed that the horrors they committed were only figments of a dream conjured up in the land of nightmares. He closed his eyes and saw the face of his wife and his son and daughter. William whispered his own prayer, that he would see them again, but felt there was a reason Thaddeus knew about them, why he used them as a carrot on a stick, and ultimately that for whatever reason, they may not be alive. As he pressed his hands against the temples of his skull and sucked in the damp, moldy air of the dilapidated manor, and the hours of the night waned, he released a silent scream that felt too loud. His stomach pained for food, his mind racked itself for the truth, and in this moment he exhaled a deep breath and fell asleep, because what else could he do? William felt a sharp poke into his side. He rolled over toward the direction the hand was pushing him. Whatever the poke was left his body, the push of the finger ceased, and suddenly he felt a burning sensation at the point of entry. William opened his eyes. Thaddeus leaned over him, 6 inches from his face, and whispered, "Shh. It's a dream. This isn't real." William noticed Theodore standing at the edge of the bed with a needle in his hand. Whatever he had injected him with had already started to take effect. The wall behind Thaddeus and Theodore swirled and their faces began to twist. Pressure built in William's ears as he tried to figure out what they injected him with. He tried to move his mouth, but the words which left sounded garbled. Thaddeus leaned back and smiled. His teeth were large, too large and warped. He said, "William, Syn's blessing gives you the ability to loose a dream. This is a dream. I'm glad you invited me into it." William thought, "This isn't a dream." He tried to say the words, but nothing made sense. William blinked as now the colors began to bleed into each other, and he felt as though he were falling. He leaned against his right arm and tried to focus on Thaddeus's hideous face, only to discover that now he didn't have one. William mumbled something incoherent, and Thaddeus replied, "This is a dream. Look around. See how nothing makes sense. See how everything is distorted and surreal. Do you understand now? Dreams are gateways into our darkest desires. And what is that? What is that? You are hungry, eager, ready. This is a dream. Let's enjoy it." Thaddeus extended his hand for William. William tried to reach for Thaddeus's throat, if only to crush it, but couldn't lift a finger. Thaddeus said, "You can trust me, brother. Come, we must secure ourselves more food and labor." William took him by the hand, and together they marched down the hall. As Theodore passed each room, he knocked on it and told whoever was inside that it was time to leave. One by one, cultist after cultist filed into the hallway, dressed in their dark gray robes and concealed by their hoods and mouths agape. They followed Theodore, locked inside of a nightmare. William, against his will, followed Theodore, mouth agape and all. Thaddeus led them out of the manor into the docks. They climbed into the canoes and followed Theodore as he paddled to their destination. The purpose of foraying into the night, William didn't know. The plan, he didn't know that either. Seven canoes rode through a murky swamp, often emerging through sheets of moss. Concealed by the night, they moved quietly. They did not splash as they pushed the paddles through the water and duckweed. Landfall emerged, and they paddled to the shallow beach at the edge of a vast prairie. The open campsite was encircled by trees, and at the center of it was a single tent. Campers, enjoying the Conecuh National Forest. William recognized this place. It looked like the campsite he was at, but he didn't see his tent, or worse, his family. Thaddeus pointed at a tent far in the distance and said, "My dearest grandson, Theodore, has indicated there are 3 adults, 2 men, 1 woman, likely a family of 3 camping." William, trapped in his mind, knew what was about to happen. Thaddeus gestured for him to cross the fields, and against his own willpower, he climbed out of the canoe and walked toward the tent. Mud sloshed against his boots as his robe became soiled. William pushed on, though he did not want to. The field swayed and the night appeared to be made of pastels. He felt as though he were hallucinating or trapped in a nightmare. It was real. It was all real. As the distance between him and the tent shrank, he noticed that 3 other people flanked left and 4 flanked right. A few of them held ropes, others held towels, and Theodore held a black towel, dripping with a foul-smelling substance. William thought that perhaps it was chloroform, but changed his mind. Whatever was on that rag smelled earthy, organic, made locally by some kind of plants. It was then that he deduced that Thaddeus was a skilled alchemist. The drink which cured him, and the water which poisoned him, the injection which put him in this zombified state, and whatever foul substance was on that cloth. William tried to think of what Thaddeus could do next, but even his thoughts began to wander beyond his control. As they approached the tent, Theodore gestured for everyone to back off. He gingerly unzipped the tent, and one by one, he smothered each person with the cloth. At first, they jerked up and tried to fight, but after 4 seconds, they were unconscious. Theodore waved for his fellow cultists to enter the tent, and they did so. 3 small troops, consisting of 2 people each troop, approached the tent. William grabbed the older-looking man and placed him on a stretcher laid outside the tent. He helped lift the woman, and then the other man as well. The oldest man appeared to be in his 60s, and the other man and the woman beside him were in their 30s. Thaddeus stepped beside them and scanned each of their bodies. A certain hunger manifested in his eyes. These human beings were prey to him, and he was hungry. He said, likely husband and wife and father-in-law, "Keep the husband. We will consume the others." William felt his stomach drop as he lifted the stretcher and helped carry the woman to a vacant canoe. Once there, they bound her tight. The same process was repeated for the others. As she was laid in the canoe, they placed the black rag over her face. William watched as the 2 other people were bound and placed in other canoes, and he felt his stomach turn and something squeeze his throat shut. William wanted to vomit. Perhaps it would wake him from the nightmare. He wanted to breathe, but it was difficult. William now played his part in this hideous cult, and he knew it. Thaddeus stepped beside him and placed his hand on William's shoulder. He said, "Remember, this is all a dream." William felt something course through him as his sight faded, and he felt himself slipping away from reality. Whatever was flowing through his body wasn't finished with him yet. Beside him stood Marie, and she said, "It's not a nightmare. It never was." As he looked forward, everything flushed to black. William's legs hurt, as did his arms. His head throbbed, and his neck was stiff. The rays of the sun were blinding, even though his eyelids were shut. The song the birds sang, rustling of blankets, and his heart seemed to beat too loud. He could hear it, all of it, even her sitting beside him breathing. Marie whispered, "How was your sleep?" William sat up in bed and looked around. His clothes were clean. He wondered if what happened last night really happened. He said, "Did we go to a camp?" Marie's eyes shifted towards the door and returned to William. She said, "I don't remember all of my nightmares, but last night I remember flaying their skin and peeling it off. It was a nightmare. The meat is gone. It always disappears, but the bones don't. The gators eat them. William pushed his face into his palms and coughed speckles of blood into his hands. He whispered, "Has anyone ever tried to run away?" Marie's eyes darted back at the door and then returned to William as she said, "They die in 6 hours. I've seen 12 people avoid drinking water, then they die. Each time, they die. Thaddeus made something that spreads on its own. I don't know what it is, but it's like the poison grows, and then Syn's blessing causes it to stop and maybe even die. People have snuck the blessing and drank it whole, only to still die. William, if someone ran away, they probably died somewhere in the swamp. It's easy to get lost out there." She bit her lips and stared at the door. William hadn't heard the footsteps approaching. Marie realized it was another cultist leaving the room and descending the stairwell. She whispered, "We peel the meat from the bones and freeze it, pitch the bones to the gators and let them eat. They don't leave anything behind." William closed his eyes and saw the face of the old man from last night. He felt as though it were a nightmare. Everything felt off and wrong. He chewed on the thought and returned his gaze toward Marie. He thought, no, that couldn't have been real, because if it was, then that means I did something absolutely horrible. He looked at Marie, and then everything made sense. These cultists took his family in the same way he took the family from last night. These cultists were drugged and under the control of Thaddeus. William frowned as the truth became inescapable. He said, "Did you have a nightmare about a woman, a young girl, and a young boy before I arrived?" Marie nodded. "I did. When I was done, I laid them out on the table. The nightmare was horrible, because you know how at the store they lay out the fish and hunks of meat, crab legs, and other stuff on ice? That's what it was like. Body parts spread out on a pile of ice. I don't like those nightmares. I just remove the skin, then someone else takes them apart." William looked down at his ankles. He felt a white-hot rage boiling in his chest, but also knew that Marie probably felt the same way he did last night. She didn't have a choice. No one did. That didn't ease the pain. He said, "You sure that was a nightmare?" Marie swallowed the knot in her throat, and tears edged at the corner of her eyes as she said, "It has to be. Otherwise, I'm a monster." William studied Marie's face, searching for remorse or regret, and found all of those things as well as disgust and self-hatred. He knew that last night wasn't a nightmare, but he understood how slippery the slope of delusional thinking is. Combine that with denial and trauma, and it makes sense why Marie would believe everything is a dream. His heart ached as he stared at her, and his stomach turned as he realized she was likely the last person to see his family before they met their end. William said, "We could run away, burn this whole manor down." Marie's eyes opened wide, and she hissed, "Everyone will die. No one knows how Thaddeus makes the antidote." William examined his thoughts. The idea of torching Thaddeus or dragging him out in the swamp and feeding him to the gators or running away crossed his mind. He thought about the other cultists, and they were in the same situation as him, poisoned and kept alive by an antidote that only their oppressor could create. His throat felt tight as he said, "I really don't care. If my family is gone, then there's nothing left to live for." He lifted his gaze and looked at Marie. "And there's nothing left for you to live for either. None of this is a nightmare. What Thaddeus makes us do to other people is the same thing he did to our families." Marie's lips curled as tears filled down her cheek. Her eyes darted for the door and then returned to William. She whispered, "How do we do it?" He said, "There's torches. Those torches are kept alight by some kind of fuel. We capture Thaddeus and Theodore. We tie them down. We drench the manor with kerosene or gasoline, torch it, and then leave." Marie nodded and studied her fingertips. She picked at them as she said, "I'm sorry for everything. Considering everything we've done, we deserve this." William stood up and approached the door. He said, "You know, I'm not any more innocent than you now, especially since last night. I think we will wait until he's sleeping. Maybe you can find the black rag they used to knock people out. I accept that once Thaddeus is gone, it'll be a slow, agonizing end. But I'll feel better knowing that no one else will disappear from that forest." Marie nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go find it and come back later tonight. Bye, William. Goodbye." William left his bedroom and walked down the hall. He opened the door next to his and found that it was empty. He checked the other rooms, and they too were empty. As he quietly searched the manor, he thought of what he could do next to get into Thaddeus's room and how to handle Theodore. William peered into the next room. No one was in there, and nothing was in there that would suggest the room he was in belonged to Thaddeus. He investigated the room next to that one, and it was the same. Room after room, all the same. He surmised that where he was likely the housing for subjects of the church. Of course, Thaddeus, the leader of the bunch, wouldn't sleep in the company of people who were beneath him. William reached the end of the hall and had no luck in finding Thaddeus's room. He guessed that his room would be much more elaborate, and then an idea crossed his mind. Thaddeus would not sleep in the area where his subjects do. He was far too important, too significant. He was Thaddeus Grimshaw X. He would be near Syn, and Syn was kept in the chapel. William spent the following day rebuilding a wall in the north part of the manor and painting it. This gave him a chance to think of a plan and how to execute it. Fortunately, there were many parts of the manor in need of care. This afforded him more time to think, but a particular rumor began to circulate among the cultists. They speculated that he may have had a heart condition or some other medical condition that rendered him comatose. Either way, Thaddeus was fuming as he had to make the decision to set a time limit for the recruit. If he doesn't wake up in 4 hours, he will be repurposed. William could only guess what repurposing someone actually meant. He drank Syn's blessing when Thaddeus offered it and committed to investigating the chapel once everyone went to bed. Thaddeus's devotion to Syn was immeasurable, and he knew that if Thaddeus were to sleep anywhere, it would be at the feet of his beloved God. He didn't know how or when or where Thaddeus will sleep, but that didn't matter. The worst that could happen is Thaddeus gives him a lethal dose of whatever he is already giving him, and perhaps succumbing would be better than living out this nightmare. William considered the possibility that Thaddeus would call for aid when captured, but he reminded himself that the other cultists are like Marie. They live in a delusional, drug-induced, dreamlike state, and maybe they would stand with him if it meant waking up from their nightmare. As the night fell upon them, William clutched his stomach and winced. He hasn't eaten in at least 4 days or drank water at all today. He has felt slightly better, but he fears the effects of the poison in his body will persist. The idea of eating anything here perturbs him, but as his hunger grew, the idea of eating whatever he could became more appealing. He sat in the lobby area of the manor. Bookshelves were built into walls and the ceiling arched high. A fireplace crackled, and he sat reading a text printed by an unknown author. It is the Bible of Syn, and while reading, he learned that the name Syn originates from the family name Sinclair. As he dug deeper into the lore of Syn, he read that the Sinclairs immigrated from Scotland and found America to be a new home for them in the year of 1633. The religion of Syn itself was no more than a family dynasty crafted for the sake of detaching from their Scottish roots and creating something new. As such, in 1652, the Sinclair became Syn, and the Theodores of the family became Thaddeus. The firstborn of each generation must bear the name of Thaddeus, in honor of the family dynasty. And though the beginnings of this religion began in earnest and mirrored Christianity, the Confederate War applied pressure to uphold beliefs, which were no longer sustainable under the new land they found themselves in. In this new America, they wanted to form their own church, to teach their own belief systems, and institute their own form of Christianity. At first, the religious beliefs of the Church of Syn were identical to the religion of origin. Be good to others, follow the 10 Commandments, uphold the beliefs the Confederate people died for. Once a pillar of the community, the Church of Syn was abandoned when the war was lost and became a family ignored, then pursued, and ultimately forced into seclusion and forgotten. Clung on to their chapel and manor, and due to hunger and desperation, the Church of Syn turned from hunting game to those who they felt oppressed them. What they did was an act of revenge of the worst kind, and then, as the decades marched forward in time, those acts became religious beliefs. The name of Syn was lost to history as they continued their relentless pursuit and devolved into what they've become today. Each generation became more morbid than the last. William sat the Bible down and digested all he had just read. The door behind him creaked open, and passing through the door was Thaddeus. He sat beside William and noticed what he was reading. He said, "That is a fine piece of literature." William closed his eyes and looked down. He replied, "Has isolation and fear driven your people mad?" Thaddeus tapped his fingertips against his knee. He said, "Mad enough to hide in the thicket of a swamp for centuries. There are plants here that have not been discovered by the outside world. No one has seen them because no one loves the earth as we do. We do not pollute it or spill oil into the ocean. We do not craft gadgets, gizmos, or toys that distract us from conversation. We are a good people misunderstood by those who do not want to listen." Thaddeus poured himself a glass of water and drank. Once the cup had been emptied, Thaddeus continued, "I know they call us the Gray Ghost of Conecuh National Forest. I know that our ways are misunderstood, and I know that our history has been scrubbed from the records of Alabama. Who would claim a family as wicked as this? Let them die. The Gray Ghost who ate your son, your daughter, their mother, let them die. My mind is a prison I cannot escape from. Thaddeus turned and faced William. He said, I hope you understand that, Brother William. I will wait for you in the chapel to release me from this wretched nightmare, and this pitiful church can die with me. Thaddeus stopped in front of the door and pulled it open. He said, But my grandson heard you. He heard both of you. Figure out how you will handle him. William sat in the chair confused. He felt as though Thaddeus was calling his bluff, and in doing so he wondered if Thaddeus wanted to perish, or perhaps it was a game of manipulation. Now knowing that Thaddeus knew what they planned to do discouraged him. Maybe the warning was as simple as this: if you come for me, my grandson will come for you. He nodded and surmised that was the message Thaddeus intended to deliver. He felt disorientated and hopeless. He worried about Marie and wondered if she was okay. He didn't know how to find her or where her room was. They had met only when she chose to meet. William couldn't remember seeing anyone else's face until a few nights ago, but even still, his fellow cultists walked among him concealed by their hooded robes. William wobbled and felt a sudden whack against the back of his skull. Air rushed past him as he fell to the floor and lay motionless, slipping into unconsciousness. He opened his eyes as far as he could and saw the door which Thaddeus passed through open. The leader of the cult returned and said, Theodore, is Marie already there? Theodore nodded. Very well, good. Take William and we will repurpose them tomorrow morning. Theodore had moved the two of them into the basement of the manor. It reeked of mold, and the floor was often wet, as the basement wasn't waterproofed. The walls appeared to be made of stones plastered together, and signs of age were present. Insects often traversed between the cracks in the wall, and cobwebs were plentiful. William and Marie hung by their wrists, attached to hook screws screwed into a floor beam. As his senses returned, he felt a throbbing pain in his arms. Looking up, he saw that his hands were bound. Glancing to his left, Marie was whimpering, and tears had already fallen down her cheek. Her head tilted to one side as she pulled her shackles. William said, Marie. Marie's head lifted. She said, Why won't this end? William whispered, I know how to get out of these, but keep quiet. I think I know how to trick these people. Theodore is going to come back, right? Marie nodded. William continued, Stay as you are, but watch. William grabbed the chain and wound it around the hook. He walked in a counterclockwise circle until the might of the hook was too much. The hook screw didn't turn as he had hoped. Despite this, he grabbed the chains and twisted them harder. Marie said, It budged a little bit. William smiled as he turned the hook screw, and it loosened enough for him to unscrew the hook. William leaned against the wall and examined his heavy iron shackles. Footsteps emerged above them, and at once the basement door opened. William returned to his hanging spot and screwed the hook screw in slightly. Theodore descended the stairs and brought with him a metal tray. The knives on top of it clattered against it with each step he took. Once he had reached the bottom, Theodore flicked on the lights, revealing a morbid workshop marred by blood. Wooden and metal tables, long and wide enough to fit a single body, were stained red. The table closest to Theodore was the bloodiest, and on top of it was a dingy old Bible. Beneath the Bible was a drain blocked by pieces of human fat. The cobblestone floor was slick with blood and remains. William shuddered as he glanced at it and forced himself to look away. Theodore grabbed a scalpel and approached Marie. He said, "I expected more from you, Marie. We took you in, gave you food and shelter, and this is your thank you?" Marie's jaw began to clatter as her eyes opened wide. Theodore drew closer and pushed her chin to the left and up. He said, "Let me get a clean swipe in, and it'll be over in less than a minute." William said, "If you heard anything, you know it was my fault. I made the plan." Theodore replied, "Doesn't matter." He pressed the scalpel against her neck. "The end is just the same." William thought of a lie and shouted, "Your religion dictates that men must die first. I read your Bible." Theodore pulled the scalpel away from Marie's neck and tried to remember if that much was true. He couldn't. William took advantage of the moment and said, "You want to go to the dark well with Syn, right? Well, you must do what the Sinclairs wrote out. Those are the rules of the religion your family made. Men must go first, as a sign of respect towards your ancestors." Theodore stepped away from Marie and turned around. He glanced at the Bible sitting on the table and approached it. William quietly removed the screw hook and faced it inward. He tightened the chain silently and wrangled Theodore by the neck. As William pulled at the chains, the screw of the hook screw pierced Theodore's throat and became lodged near the bottom of his esophagus. William released Theodore and watched as he stumbled around until ultimately he yanked the screw hook from his throat. In doing so, the threads of the hook and the hook itself did far more damage. Bits of flesh sprang from his neck and skittered across the ground. Theodore dropped to his stomach, and there he would remain. William searched the pockets of Theodore's pants and found the keys which would free him. He undid his own cuffs and then Marie's. Together they climbed out of the basement and found themselves at the southeastern part of the manor. The chapel was off in the distance. William said, "Where would the fuel be?" Marie said, "If we go through with this, everyone will die. Thaddeus is the only person who knows the antidote. William, think about this." "We're already dead, Marie. I just took out his grandson. You think he's going to let us live after killing Theodore?" Marie nodded and said, "Okay. There's a small shed by the docks. It's easy to miss because of the trees, but there's at least 15 gallons of gasoline in there. 5 3-gallon jugs." Marie led them to the dock and into the shed. She grabbed a box of matches from a shelf and 1 jug of gas for each hand. William did the same. They left the shed and scurried to the chapel. They managed to reach the doors of the chapel unnoticed, and now, as they stood before it, they knew what they had to do. William began to splash the gasoline onto the windows, wall, and even the beautiful red flowers which bloomed at the base of the chapel. Marie walked in the opposite direction, doing the same. William studied the doors and noticed they were the kind of handles ideal for sliding a sturdy stick or branch through to keep Thaddeus trapped inside. He found a few girthy branches by the chapel wall and slid them through the handles. Once every door had been barred shut and the chapel reeked of gasoline, William met with Marie at the front door of the chapel. He said, "I will go in there and ask for an antidote. Please don't start this fire while I am in there." Marie nodded. William removed the branch which barred the chapel shut. It was dark inside, and not a candle was lit. The windows seemed dark now, and the pews of the chapel reflected what little light could shine through. He searched the darkness and found Thaddeus lying at the feet of Syn, curled up like an infant sleeping beside its mother. Thaddeus whispered, "I can smell it on you. Light the match, click the lighter, set me ablaze." William said, "No. Tell me what the antidote to this poison is, or how to cure it." Thaddeus chuckled. "Did you not notice a fifth gas can was missing? It's here, here." Thaddeus removed a gas can from under the throne of Syn and poured it upon himself. Thaddeus continued, "Send me to the dark well. Do it, do it." William stepped back, for Thaddeus reached into his pocket and withdrew a single lighter. He said, "Can you run faster than gasoline can ignite, William? Can you?" Holding a lighter and walking to William, Thaddeus continued, "You've bathed the outside of this holy place with gasoline, all of it. Look around yourself and ask, who bathed the inside?" Thaddeus smiled and then continued, "Now we're in a stalemate, aren't we?" William looked at the pews and floor. They were wet, and a shallow pool of gasoline reflected the soft rays of the moon. A small puddle connected him with the madman. Thaddeus continued, "Since you're here right now, then that means you eliminated the only heir to this church. We have lived in peace for centuries and kept the eyes of the world shut to our existence. You do not understand. You do not care. You do not listen to the voice of Syn." William knew the antidote had to be somewhere, and there had to be enough to save everyone. He said, "Please, just let us go. Let us have the antidote so we can leave." Thaddeus chuckled. "The key ingredient to that antidote is something called Gasper root. For centuries we have planted it around the circumference of this chapel because it has such powerful healing properties. And you drenched it all with gasoline. We're all doomed. The roots only grow 2 inches deep, and from it blooms red flowers." Thaddeus's brows sunk as his mouth curled in disgust. He said, "And you drenched them with gasoline, you fool. I know Marie is out there with you. Look, have her look." Marie examined outside of the chapel and saw the flowers which Thaddeus mentioned. Her face sank as she looked at William and nodded her head. Thaddeus continued, "Deers, rabbits, herbivores, they love them, and they ate it into extinction. The only place Gasper root grows is at this chapel. Do you understand what you've done? There isn't any more Gasper root anywhere else in Alabama." Thaddeus hissed, "We're already dead. Once Gasper root has been boiled and the foam has been scraped off, it becomes a fungus. That fungus is resistant to stomach acid and thrives in the stomach and then gets into your bloodstream. Raw Gasper root inhibits the fungus's growth, so there is no cure. The fungus will grow and grow even after you're dead. Marie knew that Thaddeus was hopeless, and this made him dangerous. She said, "William, it's fine. We must leave." A spark spread to his fingers and then up his shirt. He smiled as he became engulfed in flames. William sprinted for the chapel door as heat began to lick at his back. Flames roared past him as he sprang through the chapel doorway and landed in the damp swamp grass. In less than a minute, the entire chapel was ablaze. William scooted away from the chapel and turned his focus toward the manor. The cultists brought them each a cup of Syn's blessing, if only to delay the inevitable. More cultists emerged from the manor, and they knew this was the end. Together, they all drank what was left of Syn's blessing, and all together they said, "We thank you for ending this nightmare." Many returned to the manor and awaited their death, while others watched the chapel burn. William and Marie scooted away from the intense heat and sat side by side. They drank their share of Syn's blessing. They watched the chapel burn until it was at long last reduced to red embers and ash. The morning sun had started to rise, and both of them were starting to feel the effects of Gasper root poisoning. They refused to go inside, as they knew the others were likely about to perish, or already did. Together, they arose and walked to the front of the house. Someone lay on their stomach, already felled to the poison. William blinked and swallowed the knot in his throat. He extended his hand for Marie's and stared at the open, swampy forest. He said, "Here, let's walk." Marie took him by the hand as he continued. "So, do you believe in heaven?" They walked through the bogs and past sheets of moss dangling from trees. The air was thick and humid. Marie nodded as she surveyed the swamp they were in. William said, "I do too. I can't wait to see my son and daughter again. I'd like to think we can celebrate their birthdays in heaven, have birthday parties where we could hang out with dinosaurs or be mermaids or whatever. I want to kiss and hold my wife again." Marie said, "God, I miss my brother. He's been gone for 3 years. He loved hamburgers. I called him Burger Boy," and Marie coughed blood into her hand and then continued, and he wasn't big. He just loved that kind of food. A real American. As they passed through the trees and the manor faded in the distance, William continued the conversation. "My wife always wanted to go to Bora Bora. So I am hoping that in heaven we can do that. It would be so amazing to go there and not worry about anything." Marie coughed once more and said, "I'd swim to the bottom of the ocean just because." They walked deeper into the swamp. The sun became warm. Marie said, "I miss my dad, my mom. I would like to have dinner with them again. Soon I shall, I suppose. Marie slumped to one side and pulled at William's arm. She pleaded, "Please, please don't stop me from waking up from this nightmare." William sat beside her and cradled her head into his lap. He brushed her hair behind her ears as she began to gurgle blood. He ignored it and whispered, "It's okay, Marie. Return to your family. Go with them." Marie's chest sank and failed to rise again. Her head fell limp as her arms draped to her side. William remained still and closed his eyes. The urge to cough overtook him, and blood splattered into his hand. Because the world started to spin and tilt, he laid down until eventually he too became paralyzed and succumbed to Gasper root poisoning. Hey, it's me, Michael. Man, my throat hurt after doing that video because I recorded the whole thing in one go. And the video itself, the story itself is, I don't know how long. It's almost 2 hours long. And wow. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you consider liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, doing all that fun stuff. And try and think of one person that you think may like this story and share it with them. Now, as for the thoughts and the origin of the Church of Syn, the idea came from a Marilyn Manson video from a long time ago, the Sweet Dreams Are Made of These video, and I had this idea of a guy who was pretty much Syn in the story was pretty much Marilyn Manson. And so that's where the idea came from. But that idea came a long time ago. I'm talking maybe back in 2008, 2009. And so the Church of Syn has kind of just sat in my head all the way up until now. But now that I've written it, it was, and unfortunately I was sick while I wrote the story. However, I still had a lot of fun writing the story, and it was a lot of fun editing it. I gave it 3 passes, so I edited it one time, rewrote it, edited it again, rewrote it, edited it again, and then rewrote it. And so what you're hearing is, I want to say 3.5 passes worth of work. The reason I say half a pass is because when I'm recording, I'm still making adjustments to the story, but once the recording is done, the story's done. That's it, no more editing. Now, as for the story, I was trying to achieve I didn't want the Church of Syn to be a gory, cannibalistic story where the people are just running around eating people, because that sounds like it would be a fun story at first, but to have a fully fleshed out story, I believe that there has to be more to it than that, and the more to it are the characters. So when I was plotting out this story and going on joyrides and trying to figure out what I would write about, I had the idea of approaching this story from the perspective of a man who was abducted for no other reason than for his physical labor. And from there, everything snowballed to where his family is abducted, and what I was trying to capture was that he wants his family, and he got to a point where he was willing to believe anything to try and get back to his family. And I wanted Thaddeus to be a stone cold manipulator, where he's willing to dangle William's family in front of him to get William to do what he wants him to do. And what Thaddeus wanted him to do was join the church, so that way he could then work on the church. And while writing the story, I never really intended for it to become a thing where Thaddeus poisoned William but also fed him the antidote. But when I wrote it out, I was like, wow, that's really good. I'm going to keep that. I'm going to stick with that. And then at the very end, I didn't even plan on writing Gasper Root. I don't know where that came from, but the idea, while I was writing, in the middle of writing, the idea just came when I came to that spot in the story where, you know what, let's make up this root called Gasper Root, and Thaddeus is an alchemist, and Thaddeus does this, that, and that, the other. And a lot of this stuff was incorporated on the rewrite, but when I was writing the rough draft, I was like, wow, that's a really good idea to have Thaddeus be an alchemist. And that's where a lot of the nuance came into play, because earlier in the story, I didn't mention any of Gasper Root or anything because I hadn't thought of it yet. So all of the subtle clues about Gasper Root, that stuff manifested in the rewrite, the first rewrite. And so that was exciting, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun creating that story. And I think I really liked the dynamic between William and Marie, which was an interesting dynamic because I wanted them to have romantic chemistry, but they couldn't because William, his family just died, and so I was in this weird space where I wanted to capture that William was attracted to this girl, but he was still loyal to his wife. And I think I succeeded in capturing the essence of that. But Marie, I didn't plan on introducing her into the story either. The goal was to just have it follow the dynamic between Thaddeus and William, but an idea popped into my head where during the rough draft I thought, you know what, I'm going to have William wake up and there's just this weird girl sitting on his bed. And then I gave Marie a voice. I know that sounds really weird, but I kind of just, let the character talk, I guess you could say. And Marie mentioned that, she's living in this beautiful dream and all this stuff. And at first, everything was a dream. So when you're hearing the story and you hear the word nightmare, think to yourself, dream, because that's what it was like in the rough draft. But in my second rewrite, I changed everything from dream to nightmare to kind of make the story more foreboding. But because of Marie, I was able to take all the other cultists and breathe more life into them, because everything associated with dreams and all that stuff wasn't in the rough draft. And so all of that stuff came in the rewrite. And so that was a lot of fun to add all of those things in there. But as for the dynamic between William and Marie, I wanted them not so much to have tension, but to have to where the listener can tell that these two characters connected, and but it's platonic. And so the end, when I got to the end of the story, I've always kind of wanted to write a story where the characters, they know that they're dying, and then as they're dying, they're walking somewhere, they're doing something, and they're talking about what they're going to do in heaven. And so what it's like is, imagine you're going to pass away in 10 minutes and you're thinking it's, right now it's 12 o'clock, but at 12:15, I'll be dead. And what will I be doing at 12:15? What will I be doing at 12:30 if there's an afterlife? And I kind of wanted to capture the essence of that, and I really liked the way I ended the story, even though it's tragic, but at the same time, Thaddeus was poisoning everybody. There was absolutely no way anybody in that manor was going to get out of there alive except for Theodore and Thaddeus himself. But since they were part of the Sinclair family, then they were not going to abandon their church. There's no way. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the last name Syn, and then name Sinclair being changed to Syn. That stuff was added on the second rewrite because Thaddeus's last name originally was Grimshaw, and the Sinclair family, which became the Syn family, was actually the Grimshaw family. And so when you're hearing Thaddeus Grimshaw, the Grimshaw in the final part of the story, I guess you could say this is canon, Grimshaw is Thaddeus's middle name, but the name Grimshaw came from the original rough draft where Thaddeus didn't have a middle name. It was just Thaddeus Grimshaw. But I kept it the way it is because I kind of like Grimshaw as a middle name, so it's Thaddeus Grimshaw Syn the 12th, and Theodore is Thaddeus Grimshaw the 10th. Or no, reverse that. Thaddeus Grimshaw the 10th is the older one. Theodore is Thaddeus Grimshaw Syn the 12th. Now the reason I named Theodore is because it would have been really difficult to follow two Thaddeus's around. And so I just named Thaddeus Theodore because that's, the name of origin. But overall, I had a lot of fun writing this story. In total, right now the project isn't done yet because I have more stuff to do, but at the time of recording, I probably put in about 50 hours into writing it, recording it, editing it, and I have sound design left to do, which is going to be another 30 hours of work, and then in total this whole project is going to run about 150 hours. And so again, that's why I'm asking, if you really liked it, please like it, comment, share with one person that you think may like it. I have a Patreon. I'm going to be completely transparent here. I'm trying to make this my full-time job. I have a lot of fun doing this kind of thing, and it's so exciting to take an idea and transform it into this. And then the YouTube, such a powerful platform to be able to go onto YouTube and share the thing I made with people. But yeah, I have a Patreon linked in the description of the video. If you enjoyed the Church of Syn and the Lost Tapes, which led up to it, which brings me to mention, if you haven't listened to any of the Lost Tapes, just go back and find those and you can watch those, and those are kind of fill-ins. They are meant to be standalone stories that if you don't watch them, you can still watch the Church of Syn and enjoy it. You don't have to watch the Lost Tapes to know what's going on in the Church of Syn. But anyways, thank you. My next project is Nazradim, and what that project is about, it's about a god that comes in to the earth realm and sucks the iron core out of the planet. So look out for that. As with this project, Nazradim, it's going to have Lost Tapes episodes which lead up to the big major video. So be on the lookout for that. And the best advice I can really give is follow my website, subscribe on YouTube, because I post mostly on YouTube, but the same thing's going to happen. 3 weeks worth of Lost Tapes, and then there's going to be 1 whole week in between the last Lost Tape and then Nazradim. So again, thank you, and I hope you all have a good night. Thanks for enjoying the story and getting this far, because this video is probably at least 2 hours long. I don't know yet because I haven't done sound design yet. But anyway, thank you. Thank you.